let's go. All right, guys, thank you so much for coming. Today we're going to talk about two things: adapting Persona 5 into a film and the curse of video game movies. Today, joining me, we have Michael. Michael, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Michael. You probably want more than that. Yeah, my name is Michael Foster. I'm here in Chicago. It's 8 p.m. Chicago time, 10 a.m. Tokyo time. So I'm having a little bit of a beverage. I won't judge if you're in Tokyo and you want a little drink. That's totally fine. We're in lockdown here in Chicago, so this is our social event, actually. So happy to see everybody here, and thank you for having me on the show.
My pleasure. So, Michael, what do you do? What's your job?
Oh God, what don't I do? Oh, this is going to be the podcast, actually. So, my day job, I'm actually an art director and a senior designer at an IT firm here in Chicago. That's like my main gig, and they treat me well, and they're awesome people. And I've been doing that for the last couple of years. But I've also, I've worked in design and art for many, many years. In the last couple of years, I helped start a campaign for a guy who's running for mayor of Chicago. That was in 2018. I've done websites and designs for a slew of clients. I'm an artist. My wife and I are both artists here in Chicago, and we have showings. Actually, my wife showed at Renee's gallery a couple of years ago. 2 or 3 years ago now, actually. So, and Renee's joining us tonight. She'll be probably part of the Q&A. And then, yeah, it's just a little bit of everything, honestly. My resume is ridiculous. And and I also wrote a book recently with my friend Russell, who's also joining us, I can see up there, called Manifestos, Reinventions, and Declarations. It's out on Amazon. And my wife and I shot a short film early in the pandemic called Life in Purgatory. And there's probably 12 other things that I'm just not thinking of right now. But recently, the book was a fun project to work on. And that's really about reinvention and how all this chaos that we're all experiencing is, we're all feeling it right now. We're all trying to process it. And, it felt like the right time. We had a bunch of articles that we had written for Huffington Post and Psychology Today way back in the day. And Russell really was spearheading that. He put it together into a book for us. And it was just hopefully it's a way to help people get through this time period. And I think that's it. I bored everybody, including myself, actually.
Not at all. That was a good introduction. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, guys, if you don't know me, thank you so much for coming. My name is Angel, and I live in Tokyo, actually. I have a creative agency here in Tokyo. We help companies with branding, social media, design, marketing. And I also run a group of professionals called Nightcrawlers. And our mission is to, promote innovation and creativity in Japan. Awesome. And yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, I'm
originally from Venezuela, but I moved to America when I was like 18. So yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's awesome. We were supposed to be in Tokyo at this time. My wife and I had planned to go to Japan this year. Last year we were all talking about it, and this was going to be the year. And then obviously with COVID and everything, we didn't make it. So this is my Japan trip right here for this year, actually. We're talking to you. So, and thank you for all joining me. So I get to have my Japan experience with a lot of great people tonight. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you so much. So Michael, let's start with the first topic. And the first topic is, why is now the time to make video game movies? Why now?
Well, it's interesting because, in the beginning of the year, before COVID hit, I had done a talk at Chicago Comic-Con a few years ago called, Pop Culture as a Visual Language. And the idea was that pop culture was becoming so integrated into our society that we almost speak in pop culture language. It helps form a certain tribalism in some cases. Like, are you a Batman person? Are you an Iron Man person? It's a way for us to sort of find these sort of virtual groupings, if you will. And so this year I said, I'd love to do a talk called The Superhero Movie is Dead. they didn't really want to do that, which probably worked out okay because by that point, COVID was surging and it was surging. It was going crazy. So basically, in terms of the blockbuster genre, especially the superhero genre, we're oversaturated. I mean, there's just been so many superhero movies. I think people are finally starting to say what's next. Plus, two, right now, as we all know, we're going through a terrible pandemic. And anytime you have something this traumatic that affects a lot of people, counterculture starts to get pushed into the forefront. You start to get new ideas, and you look at 68 or 1992, although 1992, it was more of we were getting out of a recession, the Gulf War I was happening, so it was a little less intense as 68 or the year 2020. But still, when you have these sort of just seismic events that affect the globe, people kind of want to get more serious. They want something different. I give the perfect example. After 9/11, in 2002, Jason Bourne, the first Bourne movie came out, The Bourne Identity, and everyone was like, that is great. I want to see that. And then, which was already in production for a couple of years, the last Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie, Die Another Day, comes out. And that movie was like when you go to your 20th year high school reunion and that one guy shows up who's trying way too hard because he's still stuck back in high school and it's just awkward for everybody. Die Another Day is that as a movie. It was weird. There's an invisible car. Some guy's got diamonds stuck in his face. It has there's a North Korean guy who talks like he's out of California. He has one of the best like Bond villain lines where he's like, "It is pathetic the way the West thinks it can meddle in our affairs, but you will not live to see the day." I'm thinking, how is this guy from North Korea? I mean, I know he went to Harvard. I don't know how that works. And he's a great actor. Anyway, obviously they had to shift gears. Daniel Craig took over the role and Casino Royale comes out 4 years later. There was a huge shift. You put Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins and thus begins the reboot culture. But there was a darker tone to everything. And that's usually what happens when we have seismic events like this. Plus two, why a movie like Persona 5? And we'll talk about what Persona 5 is in a minute. Right now, Japan's in a pickle because they were supposed to have the Olympics by now. And they don't. And they're going to have it next year, but it'll probably be at a much reduced capacity. And that really sucks because, man, I was really looking forward to watching that. Like, Japan does a lot of things very, very well. And that would have been it breaks my heart. But now it's like, well, the Olympics, we had to pull back on that. What other elements of like the cool Japan movement, or what can the government do to start gaining ground in other areas that they're going to lose by not having that full on Olympic experience that they wanted? So I think why? That's why. And in terms of like why, like even when this pandemic is done, everybody's been saying the 2020s, and this is the only downer part of this particular talk, the 2020s are going to be difficult. There's just too many geopolitical things at play, and it's going to be hard. And with that, we won't get too much into it, but you can research guys like Peter Zion, and you can look at like the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. They have a lot of stuff. Just put 2020 decade, ick, and then you'll see a bunch of stuff that people are very concerned about. So I think that even when this dies out, it's still going to be a tough decade. So I think people are going to want stuff that has meaning. The entertainment's going to become much more, we're going to crave something with a lot more heft to it, so to speak. And that's the long answer to that, actually.
Gotcha. So do you think that not video game movies, but superhero movies don't have that, how would you say, that creative punch that we need?
Superhero movies, the problem is they don't die. That's the problem. Like they have a Doctor Who problem, right? Where it's been on for 80 years. And then, yeah, you have the tragic loss of a character, but all they have to do in the next movie is come up with a who's it, what's it, and then they come back again. And they're talking about the new Spider-Man. They're going to bring back Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. Like there's no meaning to it. It misses out on, what we talk about drama, right? The actual like comedy tragedy. If you don't have final death, if the stakes don't feel real, it's fun, but it doesn't quite hit you hard. Like the one thing that the James Bond reboot did really well was that, or even just, well, let's bring it to Japan here for a moment. The wonderful movie Seven Samurai, Kurosawa's film. When those, without spoiler alert, it's like a 70-year-old movie, but in case you don't want to hear it, obviously not everybody makes it. But that final death, it hits hard. And without that, you lose a lot of the drama. And I think a lot of the video games, they sort of have that issue right now. Also, to like not video games, the comic book movies, they're missing that sort of like drama and heft. Also, in terms of like ROI, like we always talk about like return of investment. And the thing about movies is that they're a business. So right now, look at the problems we're having. Like, we're still waiting for No Time to Die to show up. We're still waiting for Black Widow to show up because they've spent $200 million of these movies. You can't release them because you'll lose money. They tried stuff with Mulan. It didn't really work. Tenet has been just hobbling at the box office. I don't think studios are going to want to risk that type of investment for a while. They're going to be kind of short on cash anyway for the next 5 years because of this hiccup. And when they finally get the ball rolling again, they're going to be asking themselves, well, should we do another $250 million like movie that is attached to something? Or for the same price, do 5 smaller films that aren't as risky and could pick up some momentum? And I think that's going to be much more appealing to the people who make the decisions, the pencil pushers, as they say. Yeah, so there you go.
Interesting. What about movies like Logan? Because Logan is a very niche movie. And at the end, he dies, right?
Yeah. No, that's great. But you know what's funny about that? But that's like a one-off. See, you can do Logan, and Logan did very well. It was an R-rated movie, first of all, which is like unheard of. And it's awesome. But now you can't do another Wolverine movie again for the next 20 years, or at least the next 5 or 10 years. Right. You close it off. And a perfect example of that was when Disney put out Solo in 2018. And everybody's like, man, it's a box office disappointment. What happened? And everyone blamed, well, it was because they had to switch directors. They pulled out Lord and Miller and they put in Ron Howard, who actually did a decent job with it. They blamed that the budget skyrocketed. They blamed all these different things. Honestly, what they don't calculate when they're putting in all their algorithms, when they're all sitting there trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, what they're not calculating is the fact that Han Solo died in the last movie. Harrison Ford, he gets stabbed and just falls off the bridge, That's it. So the narrative sort of finished his character arc. And it was interesting, but we are already done with that story. And so I think that a lot of times in the film industry, they're always calculating things. It's always about butts and seats, as the vulgar term is. You just want to get people to watch it. But man, if it's a good movie and the narrative makes sense, I mean, that's honestly why they don't calculate that into their decision-making, even to this day, is kind of beyond me. Maybe it's because they keep making Transformers movies and they keep getting worse, but they somehow make money. I don't know. Maybe that's what it is.
Exactly. Yeah, when you talk about Han Solo and, he dying at the end, it reminds me of Breaking Bad, how almost everyone dies at the end, but then we have Better Call Saul, and Better Call Saul is super popular, but they're telling stories about dead people, right?
Right.
But still, people watch it and they love it.
Yeah. Well, if it's well written and it addresses things that happen in the past, or in the future in this particular case, then it becomes very intriguing. But once again, there has to be the time and the patience and the care. Like, people have to really care about the property. Okay. And I know the people who do that, like, they really care about it.
Right. I want to ask you something. What do you think killed comic book movies?
Well, they're not dead yet. I mean, I'm being premature. I don't know. We'll find out when they open it up again. I just think, like anything, it's oversaturation in the market. Historically, if you look at like Western box office, there was cowboy movies like crazy in the 50s and 60s. And then after a while, you're just like, I've seen it already. Also, too, the biggest problem with comic book movies I find is a third act problem. And that the third act is always a giant battle. Like, I know there's going to be a giant battle. Like,
the lighting,
like, I've seen this 1,000 times already. Yeah. So once again, I think films that might have elements of comic book or elements of, fantasy are great, but I feel like they're going to have to be much more grounded in reality. And we can look at the Christopher Nolan work in a sense. It doesn't have to be that grounded, but more in that direction. And I guess that's where we start. That's where Persona 5 comes in.
Right.
Basically.
Well,
Yeah.
if I can jump in for a second, the two that had sort of more meaning were the Wonder Woman and Black Panther, because they had this origin story and they had more heart to them. And I think that's what Michael is saying is what's missing for most of them is you don't care. You don't care about the characters. There's no heart to them. And also the writing was really good in both of those. So.
Well, Russell, you get a pass because we were supposed to, Russell, everybody, the co-writer of Manifesto's Reinventions and Declaration. But that's funny because actually that's something that we were talking about right before everyone came on. So
yeah,
if you want to address that, good writing. Oh, but that gets in. Well, one second, we should get it back into Persona 5 because that's actually the big thing here.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So before we talk about Persona 5, we are talking about video game movies.
Right.
Why they're important.
Right.
But video game movies have been very bad.
Yes,
Since
they're terrible.
The 1990s, like very, very bad.
Specifically 1993, Super Mario Brothers. Now, I don't know if anyone has seen Super Mario Brothers. We would show you a clip, but we would run the joke saying, well, you'll die in 7 days, like the ring. No, you would die now from the brain hemorrhage that would occur because it's just so terrible. It didn't help that Jurassic Park came out around the same time. So a lot of people who didn't, if any other movie that came out that wasn't Jurassic Park, everything looked more terrible. Everything looked awful because Jurassic Park was such a groundbreaking film and now a true classic. Funny story, when Jurassic Park came out in 93, everyone thought, it's not as good as Jaws. But as it turns out, it was actually a very, very groundbreaking film. In terms of, but there's some unfairness here because they put out 1,000 movies a year, sometimes 2,000 movies a year. That ratio gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year. But there's like 50 video game movies since 1993. So that's like an average of 2 video game movies a year. It's a pretty low ratio. They make a lot more movies on a lot more different subjects. So they really need to they need to make more. I mean, quite honestly, to really understand if this is something worth pursuing. But then there's also the other fact that people like to point out that, well, a lot of times, like video game movies, the video games themselves are based on movies, right? Like Uncharted and Tomb Raider is basically Indiana Jones with different characters set in the modern era. So they're not necessarily the most original ideas. So you're already seeing something that's been done 100 times. So it's almost like, it's like eating leftovers, right? It's like you're seeing something, and also too, sometimes the games are just so fabulous that when you reserve them in a different medium, it doesn't quite, it doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste as good the first time around. So that's why I always think that when you start thinking about video game properties, part of it is you don't want to stay with the same old. Like, do we need another Tomb Raider movie? I'm sure it'd be good, but there's a lot of video games like BioShock Infinite, or what was the one? Nier Automata. There's some really, really interesting niche games that could make for excellent films. And I think that's where the studios need to start looking. They need to start getting a little bit more innovative. Yeah.
Definitely. So what is Persona 5?
Okay. So the topic of our discussion, what is this? So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. So basically, and I'll tell you about even my own experience with it. So Persona 5 came out in Japan in 2016, and then came out into the United States. It was 2017. And I'd heard about it through my cousin. I call him Little Matthew because I knew him when he was this big, but now he's this big. So it's kind of funny. I still get to call him Little Matthew. But so you got to check out this game, Mike. And basically, if you know what a Japanese role-playing game is, it's a turn-based type of game where you basically play characters and you kind of do dungeon crawling. That's the basic mechanics of it. Now, me being Irish Catholic, I got to be on an exercise bike. I just can't sit there and play games all day without doing something. So, so I'm on an exercise bike, and the RPGs work out great because they're more turn-based. The story behind it is interesting. It's sort of like if you imagine like Inception meets Scott Pilgrim versus the World meets Ocean's 11. You play a high school student, and throughout your journey, you're going to high school by day, and the game is like a social simulation during the game. You make friends, you hang out, and you do stuff. But there's a series of corrupt adults that you encounter, and usually that corrupt adult is tied into somebody that you're going to add to your team. And what happens is you go into their psyche, Inception style, right? The idea is that the adults have become so distorted, their ideas are so weird that they're actually physically manifesting themselves in some sort of metaverse, in some sort of other world. So you, with your fancy app, your character, you and your team get to go in and try to steal the thing that's most valuable to them in that distortion, that palace, if you will. And then by doing so, that character crumbles, they confess their crimes and their sins, and then, you know, good is and good prevails because the society has not they're not taking care of these things. And so there's like, you have a gym teacher who's like, well, we'll get into that in a second, but you have like a gangster, you have like a corrupt CEO, all the stuff that we always talk about, like, oh, these corrupt people, politicians, whatever. But what really made that game spectacular was in that first set. You basically take on the local, the school, the high school gym teacher, and he is abusing his students, and they don't shy away from that. He's definitely physically, and, you know, trigger warning here, they definitely hint that he's sexually abusing one of his students. Now, the game isn't done in an anime style, so it still kind of has, it's a joyful, it's a fun game. But that particular section was so serious. And at one point, there's a scene in the game where that character who's being abused attempts suicide. I had never seen anything like this in a video game before. I had to stop what I was doing. My wife, who's always doing art, like she is right now in the corner, she's like, what the hell are you playing? What is this? And if you go on, you know, YouTube, you can watch these reaction videos. People are definitely moved by this. And to Tarantino this back a little bit, I remember 8 years ago, a guy named Jesse Schell, who had done a few speeches about gamification, like the art of, he wrote the definitive book called The Art of Game Design. And he talked about, I'm muted? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get back to that in a second. Live TV, it's always exciting. I can go to earphones if you want. He talked about how when video games learned how to listen, they would become the predominant form of the 21st century. And what he meant by that was movies back in the early 20th century were considered kind of a novelty. They were like the old Nickelodeon, right? But then they started talking. And once they started talking, now it became a serious art form. And he said, eventually, video games are going to learn how to listen. Now, Jesse, I think, was referring to something that was much more technical, like you're going to be able to talk to characters in the game and they're going to be able to respond to you. It didn't take that. It just took the appearance of it. Like when you see people reacting to these scenes in this particular game, people are yelling at the screen like it's a sports game, like, no, my God, don't jump. Like they freak out. And then I realized, no, people, the game is listening. You are interacting with these characters like they're real people. And the further I played it, and the more I got to get to know the characters and the story, and what Atlas and Sega had done, I said, "This is phenomenal!" Like I was addicted. Like this is such a wonderful creative endeavor, and you don't get to see that very often. I'm 40-something years old, or I'm 44, right? I had to say something because I had to remember how old I was for a second. It's not. You don't get to see things that enamor you, you know, that much anymore. You've already heard everything. You've seen all the movies. You've seen stuff. This really blew me away. And so then I felt like, yeah, something like this could make a wonderful motion picture series if the right type of people looked at it and said, yeah, we can convert this. This would be good because it had such emotional appeal to it. And that's not even getting into the full story. We can talk about that later, but it really gets into politics. It gets into how society is distorting itself because it's afraid to change. It's really deep and fascinating. And I won't say any more because I don't want to spoil anything. You can read the article if you want to know more.
Awesome. That was a great introduction. So you told me before that you if you had control over this project, you would make a trilogy of films.
Yes.
Why a trilogy? Why not one movie or a Netflix series? Why 3 films?
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me control of these films, because nobody's making these, and nobody's ever talked to me. And I would even presume that they would want me to do this. I would be humbled and honored beyond anything. I would not know what to say. But why a trilogy? Because I think something like this that has such serious topics needs to have special care and attention. And I think, like, honestly, film trilogies, they tend to have the most prestige, right? We think about Star Wars, we think about Lord of the Rings. It also, too, it forces you to pick the best stuff. Netflix, Hulu, whatever, they always call it the Netflix bloat, right? I mean, it's great, it's fun, but you could have told this in 5 hours. You didn't need 10. Now, granted, there are people who will say, well, Persona 5 as a game takes one, and by the way, jaw-dropping moment, takes 100 hours to complete. Yeah, it takes commitment. There's a lot of story there. How would you even think of making this into a series of films? Well, if you add it up, the animation, which they did, which was based on the game, and they literally did every scene of the game. They literally walked through the entire story. That was 30 half-hour episodes. So that's 15 hours. But a good screenwriter could take that take that part of the story, and you cut out a lot of the superfluous stuff, and you just stick with the main drive, the main narrative. A trilogy is what, 7.5 to 9.5 hours. If you really want if you want a Lord of the Rings that you go like 11 hours, yeah, you can easily tell that story. And that also gets into, we'll do our cinema 101 in a second, like how you would actually convert that.
Perfect. Let me see here.
Well,
So
that's all right.
How would
You're running things. You're running the show and interviewing. Congratulations on that. That's hard.
Of course, my pleasure. Let me see here. So let's say you have an idea, you want to make 3 films. How would you get this project to be, greenlit? Like, all right, would you find a movie studio?
Honestly, that's not up to me. That's going to be up to other people who decide to do that sort of a thing. I think, like, in the end, you can pitch it in the sense that, well, the Persona series has been around for 20 years. It was based on the, oh gosh, I'm gonna butcher it. The Megami Tensei series. Mm-hmm. And there's like 5 video games in that. There's 5 Persona games. There's a whole rich history. It's like a Harry Potter level of world building already done. You can also say, well, you don't need to hire a real art department because they already did all that. Atlas does a beautiful job in terms of creating all the sets for the game, but you just need to take that work and just transfer it into the film. The only difference you would want to make is if the director or the screenwriter decides they want to, we'll make it a little darker, we'll change up the costumes a bit, maybe desexualize some things, maybe, amp up this particular character's outfit, streamline it more. Right. Or even just the areas, like, I think as a cinematographer, especially because in the game and in the movie subsequently, you're going to be spending a lot of time in the same areas. So you can pull a Roger Deakins where he likes to take his sets and the walls are all kind of crumbly and matted. Yeah. And so you can add interesting textures to what is already a very, very well built out art direction. It's already there. So you're already, part of the sales pitch is that, there's so much already built. Also, too, because just in terms of budget, like if you're, once again, getting back into the $250 million for a Bond movie you can't release, right? Something like this. And I remember a film called Bleach, which was based on the anime that came out in 2018. Now, I know they say it's $3 million budget. That really impressed me. If it was $10 million, that would have blown me away. It's an okay movie, but it's done really well for that amount of money. And then the only other thing comparable I can think of that was a film that came out in Japan. It was called Rurouni Kenshi. Did I get it right? Rurouni Kenshi?
I think it's...
You understand what I'm talking about. Came out in 2012. It was a $20 million budget. Once again, beautifully shot. And even think John Wick was 20 to 30 million. The Grandmaster, Wong Kar-wai's Kung Fu film that came out 2013 was like 40 million. I mean, that's a low budget risk for something that's a property of this stature that comes with, and I think you were saying, how many people bought the game?
So I have the data here. Just a moment. Yeah. So the series overall, people have bought 13 million copies. Persona 5 The Royal, which is the new version of the game, they bought 1.4 million. And the game itself, like the Persona 5, the vanilla version, it sold 2.7 million copies.
So you have a pretty nice built-in fan base already. And it's not a huge fan base, but it's a nice cult fan base. And see, I grew up in the 90s. So for me, the idea of like the cult status, there's something to be said about a property that some people know about, but not everybody. Because then once again, getting back into the idea that pop culture is something that's like part of a tribe. It's like something you get into. When something is not known as well as, let's say, Iron Man. Everyone knows what Iron Man is. But no one knows, a lot of people don't know what Persona 5 is. Wait, what is that? I need to know
they know Iron Man now.
Yes.
In 2008, not a lot of people knew Iron Man.
And really, wasn't it Robert Downey Jr. that made that?
Yeah.
Really, like seriously, just incredible. But also too, because once again, and I'll give a shout out to somebody. I just recently got to actually chat with, just very briefly, a guy named Matthew Alt. A wonderful man. He's written some great books about Japanese pop culture, and there's an interesting parallel to, let's say, guys who are in their 40s that in the 1980s coming up, Japan was really getting into soft power. They understood that they wanted to get back into the world scene, and by doing so, it was a huge culture push. But they're really good at culture. And they're very fascinating. What they do, Japan does a lot of things wonderfully. I mean, everyone knows about the issues. Every country has issues. But what they do very, very well. And a lot of us who were growing up as kids, besides the fact that obviously there was Japanese artists who were doing Ghostbusters and Transformers cartoons. But then, I was very lucky that I had a video store, Mokina Video. I grew up in this tiny little cornfield town that had a video store that actually carried a huge selection of anime. And this was in 1992. And we forget, for some of you guys who are young, who have all this, and we're talking to somebody in Tokyo right now, this is so foreign. When you really take a step back and think, man, 20 years ago to have even done this would have been crazy. To have everybody here all listening is nuts. But to have access to Japanese culture at such an early age, it was wonderful. And it was so inspiring. Grave of the Fireflies is still one of the greatest war films ever made. Akira, of course, is still like a landmark in animation. And also, too, when you think about it, when Akira came out, this very hardcore cyberpunk R-rated cartoon, the same time we were seeing The Little Mermaid and and Aladdin, all great, but you just didn't think, could you really do this in a cartoon? This adult, this deep, it was wonderful. Yeah. And so there's always been a sort of an allure, if you will, to Japanese culture. It's fascinating. And I think that, and we were talking about this earlier, sometimes they'll take Japanese properties and when they bring them over, like Death Note, you pointed that out in our conversation, right? I know, we start shaking our head. It's a Japanese story. It takes place in Tokyo. And then when they make the film version, they set it in Seattle. Why would you do that? That's why. It's like, it's didn't Crazy Rich Asians show us that there's a huge interest in Asian culture and people would flock to a movie like that? It's ridiculous. So I think now, especially when people want realism and people want to see something, more grounded, and Persona 5 is definitely a fantasy story, but it's definitely rooted in reality. I think people still want fantasy. They still want something they haven't seen before. Tokyo, I mean, we haven't seen enough of it in film, and I think its time has come, as a cultural and a powerhouse of ideas, and that's it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think one of the biggest problems that anime films and video game films have is that when they make them in America, I don't want to use the term whitewash, but they westernize.
Oh, use it, please. They whitewash. That's okay.
They westernize it a lot.
Yeah.
So in Death Note, like you said, it's in Seattle. They changed his name from Light Yagami to Light Turner. They made the character L like African American. So they're bringing this whole like American agenda into the film, and it completely destroys it, because these films that come from manga are deeply rooted in Japanese culture. And what is the main theme of Persona? It's fighting corrupt people and corrupt government, but at the same time, it's about being your true self.
Yes.
For
And it's in
American-
Tokyo.
For
I mean,
American,
in Tokyo, really that movie, like that I should say that video game, it does for Tokyo what Ferris Bueller's Day Off did for Chicago. It's like a
Right.
travel log, basically.
Exactly.
But go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but just for
no,
people
no
who don't
worries.
know.
Yeah, exactly. So what I was going to
Yeah.
say is the themes are very rooted in Japanese culture.
Yeah.
The theme is being your true self. To Americans, that doesn't mean anything, because people are always themselves. But in Japan, being yourself is huge. It's like the
Yeah.
bravest thing anyone can do. So if they want to make it successful, they gotta be very, they gotta honor those themes in the movie.
And I
keep
think,
it
yeah.
Japanese.
Well, I think like okay, so let's say for example, they say, hey, Mike, write it. Okay, blows my mind, but sure, why not? Whoever writes it, if it comes from, let's say they decide to have somebody who's Western write it,
Right,
because I think regardless, you're going to need somebody who has Western sensibilities and somebody who has Eastern Japanese. So this is going to take at least 2, if not 3 people to write the screenplay.
Yeah.
And by the way, the whole thing about being your true self, yes, in Japan, that's something, and there's a lot of scholarly articles that talk about it, that's something that Americans, we just don't get, because we're always ourselves all the time to a point.
Right.
To the point, we're so independent, we can't even synchronize on the basics, as some of us are realizing.
Right.
But in terms of, the other theme being fighting corruption, I mean, quite honestly, that rings a bell with Americans all the time. Americans, if you put any story about fighting the system, I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
So I think Persona 5 already meets a lot of those requirements for both East and West. Now, in terms of the actual, like, okay, so let's say let's have some fantasy filmmaking moments here.
Sure.
So let's say you actually get the budget and you're going to spend some money. You start hiring the cast. Well, first of all, the cast has to be entirely Japanese.
Yes.
The only character, there's a character, her name is An Takamaki,
Yeah.
and she's blonde-haired, blue eyes. So, and I did actually do research on genetics on this. It is very, very extremely rare you actually have a Japanese person who's blonde hair and blue eyes. So you can have that particular actress be somebody who's more Caucasian than Asian.
Right.
You worry about pushback because a lot of people get, and rightfully so, because of the years of whitewashing, get like very touchy about this sort of thing. And I get it. But then again, too, what's interesting is that if you make her character the love interest of the main character, because in the game, you can make any character your love interest. You can kind of choose. It's kind of the fun of the game. Yeah. But if you make her the love interest, now you've got a wonderful dynamic. You have an Asian male and a Caucasian female in a romantic relationship. And quite honestly, we just don't see that enough in cinema. And I think there's once again, you get into embedded racism, you get into, just long standing sort of ideas of like, well, what an Asian male is. Right. It's BS. I'm not going to swear. It's crazy. Right. But you can now if this is a movie that's all about like fighting the system, I mean, in its roots, it would make sense to actually even address that. Let's throw that in as well. That, you can have an Asian male and a Caucasian female relationship. Let's just do it. So you have to have, so getting back to that, so it has to be an all Japanese cast. In terms of the language, is it done in Japanese or English? I think if you want to try to get those dollars in the West, you make it both, and you can find a clever way to do it. The movie's mostly in Japanese, but let's say, for example, there's a lot of scenes where we're out in the Tokyo subway and they're talking about their plans, right? Well, obviously, that's not the best idea. Well, they can be talking in English when they're in a crowd, because it just adds that layer of, well, not everyone speaks English. So if we talk like that, if someone overhears, they won't quite pick it up. Or let's say, for example, in the most of the game, actually, it's another fascinating aspect of it. It's done in an interrogation room. So it's all done in backstory. Yeah. So you have the prosecutor, Sei, She's yelling at Ren, what we call Ren. He actually doesn't have a character name. You pick the name for him, but canon, his name is Ren. She's interrogating the whole time. You can do some of those segments in English because once again, the cameras are on. They're trying to be a little more sneaky.
Right.
And so at least you're offering an olive branch and you're to the Western audiences and saying, well, this isn't going to be a completely Japanese language film.
Right.
And obviously the people who are in the cities won't mind, but if you want to try to get the people who are in the farmlands, the people who maybe aren't used to foreign language films, it's a nice way to create that. But once again, these are decisions that will have to be made by the people who have all the algorithms. Exactly. Netflix has a whole bunch of algorithms that I'd love to see to see if this would even be feasible. I think it is. I think if they did research, they'd see it.
Yeah, I have a different opinion.
Oh, what do you think?
Yeah, if I was in charge of making the movie, I would make it 100% in Japanese.
Okay.
100%.
Yeah. No, I mean, and by the way, nobody's making this movie. Every answer is the right answer.
Yeah, exactly.
When we do the Q&A and everyone wants to jump in, we're all right. And why would you make it 100% Japanese?
I make it 100% Japanese because, of course, we want to pay homage. Like, we really want to honor that this is a Japanese film made by Japanese people in Japan. So if we make it in English, we downgrade it. It's not as authentic as the video game. And we see films like Parasite, all in Korean. I don't speak Korean. And I love Parasite. And it was
it's a great movie.
Successful all over the world because of the story. Also, there is a movie called Letters from Iwo Jima.
Oh, yeah.
Made by Clint Eastwood. The director is American, but the whole story, the cast, everything is in Japanese. And it brings a sense of realism into the film that if you make it in English, it would really take you out of the story.
Oh, well, yeah. I agree. I wouldn't have, and even then too, I wouldn't even make the film mostly in English, maybe a third in English. Right. It'd still be 2/3 Japanese. But once again, we'll let the pencil pushers figure out if they think it's necessary.
Exactly.
That being said, I agree with your mentality. Like, I think, it'd be better to do the whole film in Japanese. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of, once again, the ROI. Mm-hmm. People want to return on investment, and we can fantasize all day about films. Right. But we always want to calculate, well, what's going to make people around the world more interested in it if we have to make a few extra bucks and then get the budget up? Right. But I think, it's funny. I got an email from somebody, and I've been trying to get his permission to post it. He actually came up with a whole idea for this turning this video game into a movie. And it's so far out there. He makes so many changes. And what I got out of it is that I think that this particular fan base would be up for more creative ways to tell this story.
Okay.
Which I think that's actually a very, very nice thing. I think when you're trying to, a lot of times what happens is when you're trying to convert a video game into a movie, you get locked into that presentation, right?
Yes.
Perfect example. Like most video games play out like stage plays. And actually, a lot of American films nowadays, and part of my gripe with superhero movies, is that they're shot like stage plays. They're shot like this, basically. We're all talking to each other.
Yeah.
What happened to using the camera as a tool to tell the story? Just tilting it this way, all of a sudden it's a different feeling.
Yeah.
How are you doing? Like, it's amazing to me that we've kind of forgotten those techniques. And by the way, so if you're doing a video game film and you have to try to compact a lot of story into a small amount of space, if somebody really passionately loves the property and they're involved with the screenwriting process, involved in the directing process, if there's, this isn't something that you have one guy do this and one person do this and somebody do that. It has to be, this has to count.
Right.
Especially if you want to get into that prestige category. You have to have somebody who has a vision, who can really pull it all together.
Right.
Because when you're writing it, if you know what the budget constraints would be, then you're not necessarily writing these very crazy CGI loaded special effects scenes that there just isn't going to be a budget for.
Right.
And also too, and just to take a little knock at all of that CGI in film, they always say that the best, the most, the scene that everyone talks about the most is in the dark night when they flipped the semi over on State Street.
Yeah.
And they really did that.
Yeah.
You know, if you were there at 2 a.m. in Chicago, you saw a truck go flying over. Like that actually happened.
Right.
No CGI.
Exactly.
And maybe a little bit to tweak some things, but you know, there is something to be said about shooting something live and seeing it as opposed to just slathering CGI all over the place.
I have a question for you, Mike.
Yeah.
Mementos. You're talking about CGI. How would you make Mementos possible?
Okay, so for those who don't know, you spend half of the story in Japan. Basically, you're a high school student. So for all of that, you probably would find an abandoned school, which they have plenty in Japan and in the Tokyo area. You would probably find several schools because their population is aging rapidly. They don't have as many young kids as they used to. More on that later in terms of demographics. It's an interesting thing what they're doing over there. But they you know, you can have a school building take care of all that. So a lot of that stuff you can shoot, you know, if you think about like the movie like Someone in Love in 2012, and I'm trying to remember who was the cinematographer for that. It'll come to me in a second. It's a wonderful movie. It's an Iranian director, and he talked about whatchamacallit, like it was the same cinematographer as Battle Royale from 2000. I'm going to look it up. I will have that name of that person in a second. You can shoot a lot of that stuff very sort of like natural. You think about movies like Shoplifters, right? Hirokazu Koreeda. I always butcher people's names, even if they're English. I'm sorry. Hirokazu Koreeda, who did Shoplifters in 2018. If you like Parasite, it's a very, very different movie than Parasite, but it's a beautiful film. It's available on Hulu if you're in the States. You can shoot a lot of that simply. When it comes to mementos, you're just going to want to try to do a lot of it in stages. Like you can actually create stages for the different palaces. Like one palace, for example, is the evil gym teacher. He thinks he's the king of the castle. So you're in a castle, right? So you can build out these particular stages, whether it be the bank vault, whether it be a castle, whether it be the Egyptian tomb. The real trick to that is lighting. And I know you're a big Blade Runner 2049 fan. So keep things darkly lit, keep things smoky, and then use colored lighting.
Right.
John Wick actually used that to wonderful effect, where you have a smaller budget, and in order to hide things, you can use darker lighting and effect lighting to help change it. In fact, it's funny because Blade Runner, that's why it looked that way. Because remember, Ridley Scott is back in 1982. He shows up to the sets. He's like, these things look terrible. This is so bad. We can't use these sets. So what did he do? He turned off all the lights. He threw smoke into it, and then it looked amazing. Awesome. And then everybody wants the Blade Runner look. So I think in the end, you would build things out in sets. You can fill in CGI where you have to, especially for the characters and stuff like that, for like these sort of like shadows and creatures. There's a lot of creatures and stuff that walk around in these parts. But you would once again just low budget, smart filmmaking.
Okay.
And keep it more intimate. You don't have to try to impress with big giant scale. Keep things close.
Okay.
I think. Even like, in the game, you have these giant monsters, right? They turn into monsters. Like, why do that? Make them smaller. Make them smaller, more effective. Mm-hmm. And that's something we could talk about too, like how you would break down a scene like that.
Speaking about monsters, there are some very edgy monster designs in this game, especially in the first castle. There's like a monster who's shaped like a penis, right?
I think that was halfway through. Yeah, no, you get rid of all that. You can't. You gotta scoot it. You gotta think PG-13. And I think because if you want to have your rate of investment, like you want to cut that out.
So do you want to make the film PG-13 or R-rated?
Oh, PG-13 all the way. These are we want to, because I think this story would work so well with people who are in their teens. Like you got to get them into the theater. Mm-hmm. I think this, especially with everything that's going to happen. You think about the 2020s, like we're just getting started. The fallout of what we're all experiencing right now in this COVID restricted environment, we're really not going to feel the pain until about 2022, 2023. Even when we're out and there's a vaccine or we've learned to manage what we're like this situation, we haven't really felt the pain. I mean, I remember when the economy collapsed in 2007, we didn't feel it personally until 2009, 2010. So I think young people are going to want to have stories that are original. If you're Gen Z, you want an original story that speaks directly to you.
Right.
I mean, I love the fact that there's 58 Star Wars movies now, but you know what? That was my gen. Like, I think young people need to have something that belongs to them, that isn't something that has been co-opted by an older generation, or is just the same old, you know, just getting recycled over and over again. And I think stories like this could definitely speak to them. So yeah, so I think you would have to make a lot of creative decisions, but I think you can, you know, once again, there's like 150 monsters in the in that game. You just pick 12. Pick the 12 you like. Jack Frost would have to be one because he's kind of iconic. You don't have to feature every single element. Knowing what to keep and what to cut is going to be critical for success in a video game movie.
Right. But, you know, in the game, there's many adult themes, like sexual assault, suicide. How can you push the PG-13 mark to include those topics?
Well, you know what's funny? Because young, you know, I always forget. My wife and I don't have kids, and I always forget just how smart young people are. They're way smarter than even we were, and we thought we were pretty smart growing up in the 90s. Young people are very smart. And I remember I just recently saw a movie called Booksmart that was directed by Olivia Wilde. And that movie was so like, wow, like kids are just, they're way more accelerated than even I realized. It was a teen movie. It was R-rated. But I started to realize that well, you can shoot things in a way that it hints at stuff without showing it. And honestly, if you look at the old Hitchcockian way of presenting cinema, right? Like they always talk about the famous scene in Psycho with the knife, right? The knife comes down. You never actually see the knife hit anything. You just see this, you see her screaming, you see blood, and that's it, right? So you can portray things that are happening without actually showing them. You can maybe, you know, like in that particular case, because they don't even show it in the game, it's all hinted at. You know, all it takes is just simply an awkward scene with somebody locking the door, locking somebody into a room, you know, and just that sort of mood. That would stick way harder and be much more upsetting. A wonderful, you can watch, there's a film called Mustang. It was I think it was Hungarian or Turkey. It came out in 2015. It's a beautiful film about 5 young women who are sisters. And one by one, the aunt and uncle are just trying to get rid of them. They're trying to get them married off, right? Except that it's a very abusive family. And they never get explicit with it. You never actually see anything that's super uncomfortable. You just see aftermath. But it was done so beautifully well. In fact, I remember seeing the ending of that film, without giving away too much. If you do check it out, Mustang 2015. One of the kids finally escapes this home, and she gets a ride from basically the local truck driver. Like he knows their situation. And towards that ending sequence, she gets on a bus, and this actor, it's very brief, right? She gets on the bus, she's looking at him, and he just kind of, you can tell he's holding it in. He just kind of, he does this thing where it kills me. This just one moment in this film. And then he just kind of sucks it up, and he waves goodbye, and he kind of sees her off as the bus is pulling away. It is probably one of those beautiful shots I have seen. It's just a very simple shot that I've seen in the last 10 years. And when I saw that, and at the time I was actually playing this game, I said, if you give this game that treatment, like we talked about Shiho, who's the character who tries to commit suicide, she survives. But, you know, the game does this beautiful job of seeing her off. Like, remember, she goes back up to the roof, but this time the roof is all fenced in, and they're making their peace with what they've been through.
It's 9
And I'm
o'clock.
thinking, it's 9 o'clock in Chicago. That sequence where, you know, you play it off like that, where it's very subtle and very sweet, it can mean so much to a young person, because let's be honest, there's a lot of bad things happening in this world. And I think this story could really relate to them, and you don't have to be explicit.
That's perfect. I love that.
Yeah.
Let's go to our breakdown of a scene section.
Okay, and then we got to open up to Q&A because everyone's been listening for so long.
Exactly.
We got to get some.
So the scene is Haru and the Phantom Thieves confront the evil fiance.
So basically, and getting back into what we talked about, like with video games, they use a stage play aesthetic, right? Everybody like us, we just talk about what we're feeling. because there's no other way for me to express how I feel unless I'm talking to each and every one of you right now. That's it. I don't have camera, I don't have lighting, I don't have editing to really portray an emotion, which is why all these talks, I mean, they're fun, but they're also kind of boring. I mean, I admit it, right? If I could only get, you know, Christopher Nolan to record and edit our Zoom call, it would be amazing, and probably be 10 minutes. So like let's say, for example, in this video game, you know, there's this confrontation where one of the other characters, Haru, who's a real sweetheart of a character, she's kind of being forced to marry this person because his dad's a CEO, her dad's a CEO. He wants to kind of marry the businesses together. And by the way, I didn't realize that arranged marriages was still kind of a thing in Japan up until, I don't know, it's been a couple decades it's kind of faded out, but I didn't know it was a thing. And so the whole scene plays out, this confrontation with this character, kind of like everybody speaking their mind, like a stage play. It's okay. Takes about 2 minutes in the game to play out. So like if I was, and I'm going to mention characters that once again, you guys aren't aware of, but you just run with me here for a moment, okay? So if you do it as a film, so let's say you have Haru, she's having a scuffle, the fiance's grabbing her and kind of hitting her. Remember, he kicks the cat. There's a character in the game that's a cat that in the metaverse is actually a real character, but he goes back and forth between the worlds. He's kind of like, it's an interesting character. He kicks the cat, which was the other gasp moment of the game. And then he's kind of hurting her. And then the gang shows up. So like if I was shooting it as a movie, he's grabbed her and maybe he pushes her. And I think if you show abuse in any movie, I think it has to be not fun. I think David Lynch puts it best. He says it shouldn't be exciting. It shouldn't be titillating. It should just be uncomfortable and awkward. So maybe we have this moment where it's awkward with Haru and her fiance. And the fiance, he's smug. So he kind of smiles to himself. And that's when, boom, off camera, he gets punched in the nose by Ryuji. Ryuji is a character who just jumps into everything all the time. You know, he doesn't, this is not in the game. This is how you would choose. So he gets punched, flies back, you know, and then he's like, ugh, you know, he's mad. Futaba, who's like the younger innocent character, runs to the cat because she's the younger innocent character. An, who went through all this crap with her friend Shiho, runs to attend to Haru because she's just been abused. Makoto, who's now at this point of the story having a lot of tension with her sister, you know, she pulls back Ryuji and says, I got this. And then she tries to lunge after the fiance. And that's when our hero, Ren, stops, you know, because he's the leader. He stops her and says, no, I got this. Sighs, reluctantly offers his hand. This jerk of a character slaps his hand, maybe spits on it, whatever. And, you know, just kind of smug says, man, you guys are all in big, big trouble, and walks off. And then, of course, the one character, Yusuke, who's the artist, you know, he's always standing there kind of measuring things out. He doesn't really do much. He just kind of stands there observing everything. And then, of course, instead of having them all have that conversation right there in the alley, you would cut to Ren's bedroom where the whole gang is there, and maybe he's pouring her tea, her hands are shaking, and then in 30 seconds explains her situation. Now, in using camera angles and using stage techniques, we have said so much about each and every one of those characters, and all that would take place in half the time. And you get into directors like Kiełowski, who the Polish director who did the French trilogy, Three Colors, Blue, White, and Red. And he spoke that every shot, every scene that you do, that has to move the story forward. Every camera angle, every line, every note of music. If it's not moving the story forward, forget it. So when you're interpreting a video game, because video games tend to be very stage play, like oriented. No, you need to break down each scene and say, okay, we have a group of people talking. What can we do in this scene that moves the story of each character forward and informs the audience of who this character is? And that's really, if you want to know the key to making a video game movie, it's that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love it. That's perfect. Thank you, Mike. So let's go to our Q&A session.
All right. The long-awaited Q&A. Who's still awake?
So guys, if you have a question, because we have 9 people here, please type your question first on the chat box, and then I will call you out by that order. But please type.
Should we just have them raise their hand? They could ask some complicated questions. I know this group. This is a bright group.
That's cool.
There's Smart. Hey, Renee. Oh, you taking off? See you later.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay.
Renee Rose, everybody. She is an amazing gal. Well, you saw the gallery in Chicago. You want to get to know her. Make sure you friend her on LinkedIn. No?
We'll talk.
We'll talk. All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right.
All right.
So we got any questions? Renee's trying to figure it out.
All right.
All right.
A question from Finn.
Finn,
Hello. My
nice
name's
talking to you again.
you too. I'm finishing up my last semester at Columbia in graphic design, just to introduce myself a little bit. But I found a lot of this conversation really compelling, and I've actually been thinking a lot about a lot of these things that we talked about here. One of the things was regarding the cult following that you were talking about with this game. Because it really does have an incredible cult following. And I think that what you said about them being very adaptable and open to changes within the story is very true. For example, I think Persona 5 is so different in a lot of ways stylistically than some of the previous games.
Yes.
And I think that the camera angles and everything would play in super well to the gameplay itself. But for the cult following, I think it's really a luxury that the fan base is so willing to change, because other ones aren't. Like, for example, horror is one that I'm very interested in. And a lot of the horror fans, if you kind of revamp something or recreate something that was made in, like, for example, 84 or something as a splatter film, you remake it, the only successful one has been, the Evil Dead remake. So I'm just wondering what you think would be the best solution to that, to making sure that the fan base would be open to those different changes.
Do you want to run with it first, or you want me to take it? Okay,
Yeah,
I'll run with it. Okay,
Right,
I'll run with it first. So, so obviously, for a lot of people that don't know, and it's worth, in the end, just so you know too, we actually created a playlist of videos on YouTube that illustrates a lot of the things we've talked about. And honestly, we didn't even get to half of it. There's so much more we can talk about. So in terms of, like, because the game has so much style to it, obviously you're not going to be able to transport all that into a film. But for example, you talk about like angles and things. Like, if I would have my cinematographer, as they're shooting the movie, right, use a lot of Dutch angles, because the game is all very angular anyway. And then in terms of like set design, have red, like not everywhere, but you can have a color palette. Like, a lot of people don't realize this, but the movie Skyfall is really all blue and gold. That's really the color palette of that film. And then also grays if they go into certain areas with like a blue tint. Like, you pick a color palette, but in the set design, you can have bold, swaths of red, whether it be, it could be, obviously the gym uniforms are red in the game, but, you can have a little bit more freedom in terms of like how you design the sets, just to make sure that, like, anything about getting back to the Three Colors trilogy, red, or, there was a lot of red in that movie. So that way it feels like the game, and you put in a lot of sort of meta things from the game into the movie. Like, for example, there's the artist character, Yusuke, and Yusuke is always drawing. Well, if you've seen the art direction, the artist who does the team is incredible, but in particular the artist, and I got his name here, Shinganori Sojima. Shinganori Sojima. His work is so brilliant. You can have that character drawing his style. So, like, when he's drawing the characters, you can just kind of be sketching, and then you're seeing that sketch that you so associate with the characters in the game. Like, he's just kind of drawing it like off on the side. You can do that. In terms of, obviously, the music, you're going to be pulling a lot of music for the game. Every element of the game that you can sort of like squeeze into the film in a way that doesn't seem contrived. That's how you can keep the fan base like locked in. To the fact that this is an actual Persona 5 movie. And a perfect example is the way the game starts off. You have that scene, there's a casino, they're robbing a casino. That's what you think is happening. And the helicopters come in. You do all of that exactly as how it shows in the game. And then you have him escaping, but maybe you shoot that escaping shot he's getting shot at, right? Well, you know, like when you play the game and you win a battle and he's like running and then there's like little things poof in, you know, that's the game mechanic. You can actually have that scene right in the beginning. The first shot, as he's running, it's mimics that exact shot. And as he's getting shot at, little poofs of smoke are happening anywhere. And I think within 5 seconds, you have locked that audience into the movie. And I think that's really the key, is finding clever ways. You don't want to embed the game mechanics into a video game movie. That's how you kill a video game movie. A perfect example of that was the movie Battleship. Not a video game movie, but I don't know if you've ever saw Battleship. It's so bad. They felt the need to be able to put that game mechanic, B4 hit, C9 hit. How did they do it? They had aliens show up and apparently were in a bubble. I didn't even watch it. I heard about this from my brother, which is probably the better way to hear about this story. That they had to like guess at where they were at. You're really going out of your way to try to work a game mechanic into a movie. Forget it. If it do not confuse game mechanics for narratives, it'll be the death of you. So I hope that kind of answers that question.
Yeah, that was perfect. Awesome. And
you got any other questions?
Question.
Yeah. Hey.
So one of the things about this particular game is it's done in that anime manga style.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be more effective to follow that as an anime itself and just do an animated movie about it in that anime style as opposed to doing a live action film?
Good question. Now, they've already done an animation, and it's okay. The biggest complaint about the animation is that they tried to match the game story step by step by step. So if it happened in the game, it happens in the animation. And everyone's like, oh, well, we played the game. Why do we need to see that? So if you do it as an anime, like, yeah, you would probably do it like a Pixar, something that was more three-dimensional. But once again, because you've already seen it, you always want to give the audience something they haven't seen before. So a live action version would be that, oh, I haven't seen this before. I don't feel like I'm walking into something I've already seen. So I mean, if I had to pick, let's say someone said, hey, Mike, what would you choose? Like, okay, I get to make this decision, sure. You know, like, I would try to go live action because once again, the story is that good that I think it could crack that video game curse. You know, that people will be like, oh yeah, okay, they finally made a good video. Not only just did they make a good video game movie, they just blew past any expectations. But
so the other thing,
I think that, yeah.
The other thing, Michael, that you had mentioned earlier that I really liked was just the fact that you were talking about how a lot of movies now are in your face about everything, especially when you had brought up, you know, kind of about the penis monster and stuff like that. Whereas you took it down the path of you can allude to it without actually throwing a giant penis monster on the screen or something like that. I think that that's really effective with regards to movies. I mean, one of the most effective movies that I've seen a horror film-wise was The Babadook, in 2014 with Essie Davis. In that movie, you never see the monster. The monster's there and you can see things happening, but at the end of the movie, you don't know whether or not it truly was a monster or it was just her losing her mind. And the effect of how they how they filmed it, the effects of how they actually portrayed the characters, and how they alluded to kind of the situations that were going on with her just lent so much to that story. In this particular case, what do you think is the overall theme that you would have to focus on so that when someone's actually directing this actual game movie, they would focus on that and start building their illusions around that so that when they're actually coming up with the images and they're actually filming those angles and setting the lighting and everything, they follow that theme close enough to where you actually get the feeling of it without actually seeing it directly?
That is a damn good question. And give me 2 seconds. Okay, let me think about this here for a moment. The hardest part about this game is going to be, or even a lot of video games, is that they have a sort of surf and turf quality to it, right? There's the realistic portion And then there's the completely unrealistic portion. And in terms of Persona, that definitely is the case. So you're going to want to try to make sure that tonally, the stuff that happens in the real world versus the stuff that happens in the like metaverse, the dream world, if you will, that they're not so far removed from one another that that you feel like you're watching two different films mashed together. Scott Pilgrim versus the World solved this problem by making the whole movie kind of animated in a cartoon. I love that movie. It's a fabulous movie. If I only had one complaint, is that it feels like it's always going to 11. Like there's, it just is so in your face all the time. I love it. It's a movie that's so over the top that I enjoy it thoroughly for what it is. Inception took the whole other route, where the dream world felt very much grounded in the same reality that they were in, almost to the point where you didn't even know where the dream was anymore. Like, well, where the dream am I on, right? So obviously, you're not going to have that with this. There's going to be a distinction between the dream world and the metaverse world, or whatever, if you will, and then the real world. I think once again, you don't rely so much on CGI. If you can do it on the stage, that'll help convey some of the realism of these particular characters. You don't go with the more outlandish stuff. You kind of keep it a little bit more centered and grounded. So when something does happen that's a little outlandish, it kind of comes as a shock to you. And also too, and trying to tie this all back in together, these choices will have to be made. Like, it's interesting because when you think about the concept of video game, like when they did Super Mario Brothers, what was the narrative? A plumber is hopping over mushrooms to get his girl, and there's there's not a real story there. You have the exact opposite problem with stories like this with Japanese RPGs, is that there's actually so much story. There's too much. So it's really about trimming away. It's about sculpting as opposed to trying to add to it. So really knowing what to leave out and what to keep in, that's going to determine what's effective. But also too, thinking in terms of like in video games, for example, when you have fight sequences, some character could have like a bat or a whip and they're attacking a metal monster and somehow it's doing damage. Obviously that's not going to work. I mean, if you play video games, like Mario like sits his butt on a mushroom and it's like that doesn't work. But yet you have all these wonderful elements. You have all these wonderful props, and you have all these wonderful defined characters. So when you create action sequences, use the tools that they have and create sequences around that. Do what like Steven Spielberg, when George Lucas, I think it was Kaufman, who wrote Raiders of the Lost Ark. They actually said, what do we want to see in a movie? And they just put sticky notes up and they created Raiders off of that. You can say, okay, we know this character's got a bat, this character's got a whip, this character can summon a persona that like uses fire. Like, how can we create a sequence around that would be interesting using those physical elements? And on one last note, I'll get into something the great Roger Ebert once said. He said, I never understood why, like in an X-Men movie, why Wolverine with his claws goes after the other villain that also has claws. Like, if you have a fire monster, don't you just send the water monster over? Like, it didn't make sense. So I think even when you have these unrealistic elements, especially when you're in the metaverse, because that's where all the unrealistic stuff happens, if you keep it grounded in physical reality, you'll be by the premise, by the bid. People will be on board. And there you go. Does that answer? I think I just talked too much, and then everyone forgot what they asked. That's what happens.
We actually have another question from Guzman. D. Guzman.
Hello, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going. How are you?
Doing good.
Good. So my question would be, so a lot of times when you make these film adaptations from, like, whether it's mostly video games, we'll stick with that. If you decided to, or somebody approaches you like, hey, let's do this, would you gear this film towards fans, or would you gear this film towards people who haven't heard of Persona 5 before, but you know, are kind of intrigued by it, or rather, should I say, people who haven't played the game, but they are intrigued by it. So, because I know a lot of times some of these films, you know, Star Wars would be a really good example. These newer trilogies were not really meant or made for fans of the older films. So I'm just curious how you would approach that.
The answer is yes. No, I'm not going to leave it. Come on, really? That's it? I think, honestly, if you love the property and you understand the material, you can write something that is for fans, that fans will relate to, but is also for people who do not know the first thing about what it is they're walking into. I think usually the most well-written properties, the best movies I've seen are stuff that I didn't know anything about, but I was in. Lord of the Rings, and my wife loves, she's like, Lord of the Rings in the background. Like, Lord of the Rings is a perfect example. Like, I was one of those geeks who didn't read the books. And then when they came out, like, I knew of the books. I didn't, you know, it was just, it just kind of like one of those things I missed when I was in high school or in college. And then when the movies came out, I'm like, oh crap, this is great. And then I wanted to read the books. And so I think if you give it that treatment, where if somebody, the people who are in charge, you've got to love the property. You know, you really have to know it inside and out. And you can then engineer the film to where it is for people who have never heard of it before, but yet you put in enough of the material and the styling and what people expect. And that's why I think you have to have fans make the movie, because they know what they love about a property. They know what they are going to love about Persona 5 or whatever video game you do, but in this case, Persona 5, they understand it deeply. And if they're a fan, they know what they want to see. So if they want to see it, there's a good chance that other fans are going to want to see it as well. And I think in the end, what makes this property so different is that because it is such a story-driven property and is such an emotionally gripping story, and a very relevant story for the environment that we live in the 2020s, that as long as you keep faithful to that, I think people would be on board. I have a feeling that people would enjoy the story. And there you go. I don't know if that was like the best skate around for that question, but
that was acceptable. Thank you.
I actually have another opinion.
No.
Yep. So I really like your opinion, Michael. Recently, I feel like a lot of film companies, especially like Marvel Studios, they do fan service too much.
Yes, everybody's nodding. I've noticed.
Right. And not only film studios, but I feel like companies in general do pandering too much, to the point where it's not the artistic vision of the writer or the director, but it's rather an amalgamation of what people on YouTube want or what people on Facebook want. So I feel like this should be something like The Mandalorian, something that is made from a fan who loves the property but has his or her own ideas for the film, rather than just pander to the fans. Because I feel like you were complaining about Marvel films being like stage plays, and it's because all they do is listen to the audience. But if they went like all weird, like David Lynch, and made like a weird ass Marvel film, that would be pretty cool in my opinion. But again, nowadays, the vision of the artist, and if you go back to Citizen Kane is so good because it's Orson Welles' vision. Nobody else. But then again, all these new films are very
they're made by algorithm. That's what it is, right? They're made by algorithm, they're made by test audiences, and they bring everybody in. Now, I am granted on something like this, if you want to bring in people to have their opinions heard before you start, I have no problem with that, because you might get some information that you wouldn't have. But yeah, once you start making movies to please the fans, like you said, if you're pleasing everybody, you're pleasing nobody. And Rise of Skywalker was a perfect example of a serviceable, decent film that everybody liked and didn't like simultaneously. It's just seriously like I've never seen it, and that's what happens when you try to make a movie based on algorithms, based on fan service, because once again, everybody's nervous about that return, that ROI, that rate, the rate of, they want their investment back, and why I think properties like this that maybe aren't as that have a cult following. They haven't done 10, 20 different versions of this. Why I think these are going to be very, very approachable in the 2020s, because one, they're going to be more cost effective, but two, it's going to allow somebody to really take their vision and run with it. Like they let Peter Jackson run with Lord of the Rings. Like it turned out pretty okay. And the Hobbits, he probably needed a better editor and a little less CGI, but whatever. The thing is, you look at these films and they're up there, and that's it. And that being said, if they let David Lynch do Squirrel Girl, I am so into that.
Oh yeah.
Could you imagine? Like he'd be like, we're gonna do this movie and it's gonna be about a squirrel, but she's also a girl, and then that's all I'm gonna say. And then like 20 minutes, it's just gonna be shots in the trees of some character like peeking around. It would be incredible. I think if we forget the Persona 5 movie, let's get David Lynch to do Squirrel Girl. I think maybe from there we can try to pitch the Persona 5 movies.
I love it. We had a question from Russell before.
Hey, Russell. Sorry, it's Jamie's like, tone it down. I know, I get so excited. She's like, I'm like,
can you give an example of hello?
I'm here.
Can you give an example of the best and the worst example of the type of movie you're talking about?
Like, what do you mean? Like what? Like a movie from a video game. What's the very best you've seen? What's the very worst? Oh, well, there's a lot in the very worst category. I think the closest to a decent video game film, I've only saw parts of it. I can't lie to you, I haven't seen the whole thing, was the Tomb Raider reboot of 2018. It seemed like they were trying, and I give them credit for that. But the problem with a lot of films and movie making is that, it's like there's no there. And I think that's tricky because, once again, I think they were trying to walk too much of a tightrope, and maybe they were just hitting too many of the same beats that we had already seen in the game, and maybe they were playing it too safe. So it came across as the word is serviceable. In terms of worst, I mean, gosh, there's, once again, I mean, even in Mortal Kombat, which is considered the Citizen Kane of video games, it's not that great. I mean, it's a fun movie, and Christopher Lambert plays, once again, Raiden, who was supposed to be Asian. Apparently it's Christopher Lambert, and he's sort of doing a weird version of his Highlander character. He's like, I don't think so, and like lightning shoots out of his fingers, and it's bad. So
okay.
So I don't know, but to talk about a great movie from an existing property, now that could be interesting. Is there something that an auteur had taken and did something wonderful with it? I'll have to think about that. Does anybody have a film that they could think of that say, oh yeah, that was good? Let me think about this for a minute.
What was the one adapted from a novel, Ready Player One? Did you see that?
Well, yeah, Spielberg taking Ready Player One. That was an example of, that's a book adaptation, and those are done so often. That's the thing. Oh, well, okay, because Jay and I were watching it last night. 21 Jump Street, 22 Jump Street. There is an example of two guys, Miller, and you can't call it cinema. Maybe, we'll see. 20 years down the road, that might change. But Lord and Miller did a wonderful job updating a archaic television series and making it their own. I would throw those into the mix. Jay and I just watched the second one. We were just cracking up. I mean, every time you pop that on, it's hysterical. So maybe something like that.
Okay.
Once again, I would have loved to have seen their solo movie. That could have been interesting. And that gets back to our point that the Mouse House, they kind of stifle some of the creativity, because I even heard like Rogue One had the same problem where they were trying to go in and they kept messing with the film. And they kept kind of changing it on the director. And everyone's been really cool about it. No one ever says anything bad about it. I mean, it is the Mouse House after all. but you always wonder like how much of these movies are now being made by the establishment and not necessarily the director.
Okay.
And I don't say it's good or bad. It is what it is. How about you, Russell? Any? Well, you're ready Player One. Was there any other movies that you think that?
I'm trying to think. There was another one. It has this long, weird title of people's names, and that one was actually fun. I have to, yeah. But let's go back to other questions.
Okay, that's right.
Right.
I was gonna jump in and say, that you guys remember Street Fighter? Does anyone
It's
remember?
funny because somebody in our message board mentioned that, and Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat to me are kind of very similar, where it's mid-90s cheese. A lot of the movies, I mean, even like the good movies like Speed and all that, I mean, they're so cheesy. They really are. There's a gap in the road, 50 feet, Morpheus. Like, how did they get away with this? It's so silly, you know. But yeah, that one thing I'll say about Street Fighter is that Raul Julia, that was his last movie, and man, did he literally poured his heart out into that role. I give that man credit. He was gone too soon. He must have known he was doing he must have known he was doing like an iffy movie, but he didn't pull back, and credit to him. And once again, I wonder if they revisited these properties. Well, I know they're trying to do Mortal Kombat again, but it'd be interesting once again if you give somebody who's an auteur a chance to really do something interesting with it. I think you might get a really great movie.
I got the title.
What is it?
Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets.
You know what? That was a
Okay.
movie that I wanted to like so much more. Jay, remember that, Jay? We were watching that. That was the space movie that was done by the guy who did The Fifth Element, Luc Besson. And it was like, man, it was like some of the things in those movies, like it's almost good. It's almost good. It's gonna get good. It's almost good, and then it never quite makes the finish
Well,
line.
parts of it were really good, and other parts were just not good at all. So it was like, so they needed either a better script writer or someone to connect all the pieces. It was just this mishmash, and that was the shame of it.
Yeah,
But
and by
what
the
was
way,
good was great.
With a big budget or it has it's a high concept film, you always run that risk. Because as you know, like even though it's a movie, it's a project. It involves hundreds of people. There's a lot of moving parts. Depending on who you cast, like we always talk about in Lord of the Rings, like Viggo Mortensen, he played Aragorn. He wasn't supposed to be Aragorn. He was a last minute replacement. And you always wonder what would have happened if he wasn't in the movie. Would it have been as good? Would Tom Cruise have changed Iron Man? Would it not have been as good of a movie? Probably not. And so, and that's just casting. But when you think about editing, well, even editing, you look at Star Wars. The original cut of Star Wars was a disaster. Everyone always talked about it. It was like, oh, it was a mess. He just didn't quite get it. Marcia Lucas, his wife at the time, was the real hero of Star Wars because she re-edited that movie. And that's why Star Wars is what it is today, because she knew what to do with it. And so, yeah, so editing.
Well, there was an anecdote I read recently about that on the screening when Brian De Palma was in the audience, and he was the one that thought of the introduction crawl at the beginning. He's like, I love all these people. I'm interested in them, but I want to know where the hell we are. What are we doing? How did all this start? And then he said, there's got to be like an introduction or something. And that's how that happened. And that kind of became a, tag for the whole movie series.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
That was
and
De Palma.
Funny. Yeah. And as I'm talking to him, I'm seeing our thread and I'm seeing Assassin's Creed pop up around there. Yeah. That was another movie. But once again, I think that they're going to have better luck with properties that maybe aren't necessarily as beloved. Like, do we really need to do Call of Duty? Do we really need to do Assassin's Creed? Do we really need to do like Angry Birds? Like, why are we going for the obvious? Let's go for the not so obvious. Mass Effect could be interesting, although I think it's still a little bit too popular. But that could be an interesting movie. But once again, it's a space movie. We've seen it done before. Nier Automata could be an amazing movie. And actually, BioShock was supposed to be The Shape of Water. because that was what the Academy Award winning film with the lady who runs off with the fish.
Yeah.
That was supposed to be BioShock. That's why I was watching it. This looks like a BioShock movie. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, that originally started out as that. And then they're like, well, they couldn't get the rights or something. So then they changed it into something else. So
I didn't know that.
Water is a great BioShock movie. We'll just say that's really the key. Make it a completely different movie. Oh my gosh.
All right, guys, let's do one more question. Anyone has any final question?
What time is it in Tokyo?
It's 11:36 a.m.
I'm curious where, okay, this gentleman Herb has been very quiet, and I'm curious where he is because it looks like he has light in his window. So
I just don't know enough about this to make any kind of intelligent comment. So I'm just saying.
Hey, Herb. Yeah, we got to keep going. How you doing?
Hi.
Hi.
I just don't know anything about it.
Oh, that's okay. Well, we're happy to see you. Happy.
I mean, I like listening to this kind of stuff because I get kind of a different ideas, but I know so little about gaming and filmmaking that I would just sound.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us. I hope we didn't bore you, but you're still here, so we must have done something right.
Oh,
so
I just retired from my current career, so I'm looking for a new career. So I'm just listening to a lot of different things and hoping to get some kind of idea. So.
Oh, wonderful! Well, thank you for joining us. Cool. We really appreciate it.
Glad to hear new things.
All right. I think in the end, to wrap up, if you're like me and you're really big in the Japanese culture, I mean, if you have the ability to grab yourself a Criterion channel subscription, do that. Start with Ozu and Kurosawa. They're the two greats. You'll see even a lot of Wes Anderson in Ozu, and I think he'll even admit to saying that he was heavily influenced by them. In terms of like bands, if you have an Apple Music subscription, there's a wonderful playlist called Wasabi that gives you a lot of great Japanese bands, because we didn't even cover like all of the great bands that are out there right now between Chai and well, I mean, everyone knows like Band-Maid, but there's so many others, whether it be Wednesday Campanella, Glim Spanky, Aqua Gorilla, Aya Gloomy, Bish, Boris, their album Pink from 2003, Brown Butter, Haiku Garden, Luminous Orange. I mean, there's so much material. And if you find yourself really straining here in the dark days of the pandemic and you need something new to check out, there's so much wonderful media from Japan. Everyone knows anime, but the music and the movies, there's just such wonderful things happening over there. I highly suggest, taking the time to see, to find something new and find something you like. Because especially in this day and age, I think we all are up for something new.
Cool. We actually have one more question from Finn.
If everybody doesn't mind, it was just another thing that popped.
Right. Sure, go ahead.
The Shape of Water. I was thinking when you were talking about the monsters, I was thinking, why not Guillermo del Toro? He's kind of the master of that. You could bring him in to get those monsters. He would make them crazy looking. And then in the vein of what I said earlier in the chat of Geiger and Alien, for example, I mean, Geiger didn't hide any of that from anybody, but Alien did a wonderful job of adapting that so that it doesn't come as clear. You only know what it is if you know Geiger.
And I think Del Toro, there's an example of somebody who can take something that's very mythical and something very grounded and just make the two work beautifully well. And once again, I think someone like Del Toro he might go a little too fantastical. I think like for Japanese sensibilities, like when I was thinking of the movies you would want to use as a basis for like how you would do something like this, I think The Great Beauty, the 2013 film by Apollo Sorrento, Amélie, the 2001 French film by Jeanette, and then of course obviously Ocean's 11 because of the whole heist thing and the way Steven Soderbergh does cinematography. But the idea of the spacing, one of the things where Del Toro does a decent job of it, but really you're going to want to have somebody who has an understanding of Japanese sensibilities. It's a term called ma. It's about negative space. And you'll notice, like even in the Studio Ghibli, if I pronounce that correctly, sorry, movies, there's these moments where there's just this kind of quiet space for a few seconds. and they allow the movies or the cinema, you know, whatever, they allow the art to breathe. And so I think no matter what, part of the trick will be is to allow that sort of negative space into the movies. So if you get Del Toro to do it, that's cool. Just make sure he understands it. He'll figure out He can figure out that concept. He seems pretty bright.
As long as we don't get Michael Bay, we're good.
Oh God, no. Oh God. Oh Lord, that'd be a tragedy. Oh. Anyway, on that note, it always ends with Michael Bay, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. All right, then let's wrap it up. Guys, thank you so much for coming. I know it's a little bit late in America, so.
Well, it's only 9:30, man. We're just getting started in Chicago. Or we would be, but there's quarantines.
Right. No, but I just wanted to thank you guys for coming and, engaging with us. And Michael, thank you so much for your awesome insights.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's about it.
Yes. Take care.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. This was fun.
Bye-bye.